very important concept in algebra is that of absolute value. And the funny thing about absolute value is sometimes it's easier to see examples of it than it is to actually define it. So I'm going to show you some basic examples, then we're going to go over a couple of definitions and then look at a few more complicated examples. So if I say the absolute value of 16, if you've seen this ever before, we know that the absolute value of 16 is simply going to be 16. Why is that? Because basically we're taking the positive part of whatever we plug in. The absolute value drops any sort of negative. So the absolute value of 16 is 16. Whereas the absolute value of negative 16, well, that's going to also be 16. Okay, so how can we define this in terms that just make sense across the board? The most intuitive way to define absolute value then would be to say the absolute value of A is actually its distance from 0. And so you can imagine if I'm at, let's say, the absolute value of 6, if I look at the number line, that's 6 units away from 0. And similarly, if I'm looking at negative 6, I'm also 6 units away from 0. Okay, so that is an intuitive definition of the absolute value. However, it's not exactly precise. A more precise definition would be something like this. We say the absolute value of the number A takes on the value in two cases. It takes on the value of positive A if A is greater than 0. In other words, the absolute value of A is A if A is greater than or equal to 0. We saw that with the 16 here. Okay, now for the negative 16, maybe it would have been smarter if I had written it like this. The absolute value of negative 16 was negative 16, because I know negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1, so negative 1 times negative 16 gives me the positive 16, and what that does is it maintains that negative 16 that I dealt with in the beginning. So in other words, if I plug in a negative value into the absolute value, the outcome should be negative that negative number. So it's negative A if A is less than 0. So for example, if I plug in the absolute value of negative 15, well, since negative 15 is less than 0, I know my answer is going to be negative 15, which results in positive 15. This is not quite as intuitive as the distance from 0, but it is very useful. Okay, and I'll show you an example of why that's the case. So we have these two absolute values that I want to evaluate, and the first one's the square root of 21 minus 3, an absolute value. Now, square root of 21 is a real number, but it's not rational. So how does it relate to 3? And here, so my distance from 0 situation doesn't exactly clarify this. I need to figure out from my definition, if square root of 21 minus 3 is negative, then I know that the absolute value will be the negative of that. And so if you think about it, I know that 16 is 4 squared, and I know that 25 is 5 squared. So the square root of 21 has got to be in between 4 and 5, somewhere in there. Okay, so this guy is somewhere between 4 and 5. So when I say something that large minus 3, that's actually a positive value. So here, if I want to drop the square root, drop the absolute value, I'm free to do so. So the absolute value of square root of 21 is root 21 minus 3. However, now, when I have the square root of 21 minus 9, since I know that square root of 21 is between 4 and 5, this is actually a negative value. So to drop the absolute values, I have to make this a negative. Okay, so if I want to distribute that negative, I end up with 9, positive 9, minus square root of 21 is the absolute value of 21 minus 9. So see, sometimes the distance from 0 definition doesn't give me a clear picture of what's going on. But if I can figure out that this is a negative inside the absolute value, for example, then I know I need to multiply it by negative 1. I hope this makes sense. Absolute value, again, is very useful, and we use it not only in algebra, we use it in calculus, differential equations, linear algebra. and etc. It's just always useful to know. And it can be confusing sometimes, but I hope this makes sense. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.